On a busy Monday morning in 1998, the international terminal at Singapore Changi Airport buzzed with its usual energy. The polished floors reflected the warm lighting above, and travelers rushed about with their rolling suitcases and briefcases, creating that familiar airport symphony of wheels and footsteps. At the first-class counter of Pacific Airways stood a young woman in her early 30s, dressed in a crisp business suit. Her confident posture and keen eyes reflected years of business success, though her youthful appearance often surprised people who knew of her achievements. She had built a technology empire from scratch, transforming a small startup into a global software powerhouse that revolutionized how companies manage their supply chains. As she placed her first-class ticket on the counter, the ground staff barely glanced at her before saying, "I think you're at the wrong counter. Economy check-in is over there." The staff member's tone dripped with condescension, and she pointed toward the lengthy economy line without even checking the ticket. "I have a first-class ticket," the businesswoman said firmly, sliding the ticket forward again. The staff member picked it up this time, examining it with exaggerated scrutiny, as if searching for signs of forgery. "This must be a mistake," the staff member muttered, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Let me get my supervisor." She disappeared behind the counter, leaving the successful entrepreneur standing there like an unwanted guest at an exclusive party. Other passengers in the first-class line began to stare. Some whispered among themselves, while others simply looked away, pretending not to notice the unfolding drama. The businesswoman felt her cheeks burn, not from embarrassment, but from a rising anger she hadn't experienced since her early days of fighting for respect in the tech industry. Minutes ticked by slowly. The supervisor finally appeared, wearing the same skeptical expression as his subordinate. He repeatedly looked from the ticket to the passenger, making no attempt to hide his doubts. "Madam, how did you obtain this ticket?" he asked, his question implying something inappropriate. The businesswoman took a deep breath. She had faced discrimination before, but this was different. This wasn't just about her anymore. As she stood there, watching other Asian passengers being directed to economy without question, and observing the preferential treatment given to Western travelers, something clicked in her mind. "I bought it," she replied calmly, pulling out her platinum credit card and business cards. "Just like everyone else in this line. I'm the CEO of TechFlow Solutions." The supervisor's eyes widened slightly at the company name, but his attitude barely shifted. After what felt like an eternity of additional verification and system checks, they finally processed her check-in. As she walked away from the counter, she overheard the staff whispering, assuming she couldn't hear them. "These people think they can buy their way into first class now." That moment planted a seed in her mind. As she sat in the lounge, instead of reviewing her business documents, she began observing. She noticed patterns in how different passengers were treated. She started taking notes on her laptop, recording times, behaviors, and interactions. Her analytical mind, which had solved complex technology problems for global corporations, began formulating a different kind of solution. Little did Pacific Airways know that their discriminatory treatment that morning would set in motion a chain of events that would reshape their entire airline. The businesswoman pulled out her phone and made a call to her financial advisor. "Remember when you suggested I diversify my investments?" she said quietly. "I think I've found the perfect opportunity." As she boarded the plane that morning, the flight attendants still giving her doubtful looks, she smiled to herself. This wasn't going to be just another business trip. This was going to be the beginning of something much bigger than anyone could imagine. A story of change that would eventually be told in business schools around the world. Long before the airport incident, in a modest 3-room apartment in Singapore, a young girl sat at her family's dining table, watching her father study the newspaper's business section. Every evening, he would share stories about companies rising and falling, teaching her that success wasn't just about making money, it was about solving problems that mattered. 20 years later, that same girl had transformed from a curious child into one of Asia's most innovative tech entrepreneurs. Her journey wasn't a straight path to success. It was filled with the kind of struggles that shape character and determination. During her university years, she worked part-time at a local shipping company, where she noticed how inefficient their supply chain management was. Everything was done on paper, leading to countless errors and delays. While her classmates spent weekends at parties, she sat in her tiny dorm room, coding her first software solution. "You're wasting your time," her supervisor had said when she tried to show him her program. "This is how we've always done things." But she didn't listen. Instead, she refined her solution and presented it at a tech competition, where a major manufacturing company spotted her talent. That first break led to sleepless nights and countless cups of coffee. Her small team worked from a converted garage, taking on projects that bigger companies wouldn't touch. They specialized in solving the messy, complicated problems that others avoided. With each success, their reputation grew. "We don't just sell software," she would tell her growing team. "We solve human problems." This philosophy became the cornerstone of her company's culture. When a client in Indonesia struggled with tracking medical supplies to remote islands, her team didn't just provide software. They spent weeks understanding the challenges faced by local healthcare workers. By her 30th birthday, her company had expanded across Asia. The garage office had grown into a modern headquarters with over 300 employees. But success hadn't changed her fundamental approach to business or life. She still rode public transport, took time to chat with junior employees, and personally handled challenging client problems. Her travel schedule became increasingly demanding as the company expanded. She found herself on planes almost weekly, pitching to international clients and opening new offices. These flights gave her a unique perspective on how different airlines treated their passengers, but nothing had prepared her for that morning at Pacific Airways. The irony wasn't lost on her. Here she was, running a company that helped businesses operate more efficiently and fairly, yet experiencing discrimination from an airline that prided itself on premium service. As she dug deeper into Pacific Airways operations, she discovered that the problem went far beyond one bad experience. In her office, late one evening, she reviewed customer complaint data she gathered. The patterns were clear. It wasn't just about first-class service. It was about systematic biases that affected everything from seat assignments to how complaints were handled. The airline's problems stemmed from an outdated corporate culture that had never adapted to Asia's changing business landscape. Her financial advisors thought she was crazy when she first proposed buying into the airline. "Tech companies are your expertise," they said. "Airlines are a completely different game." But she saw something they didn't, an opportunity to fix a broken system from the inside out. She remembered her father's words from those evening discussions at the dining table. "The best businesses don't just make profit, they make a difference." Now, looking at Pacific Airways' financial reports spread across her desk, she knew this would be more than just another business venture. It would be a chance to prove that treating people with dignity wasn't just morally right, it was good business. As she began quietly acquiring shares in the airline, she kept her plans secret. Only her closest advisors knew what she was planning. Each stock purchase brought her closer to her goal, and with every transaction, she thought about that morning at the check-in counter. Soon, she thought, very soon, things would change. The investigation into Pacific Airways started small, like a pebble dropped into a still pond. In the weeks following her first-class incident, the businesswoman began reaching out to her vast network of contacts across Asia. What started as casual conversations over coffee turned into something much more significant. "It happened to me too," said an old college friend, now a prominent doctor. Over lunch, he described how the airline had questioned his first-class ticket 3 separate times. "I just stopped flying with them," he admitted, stirring his coffee. It seemed easier that way. But easier wasn't in her vocabulary. Each story she heard fueled her determination to uncover the full scope of the problem. She hired a small team of researchers, setting them up in a quiet corner of her tech company's office. Their task was simple but massive: document every complaint, every incident, every pattern of unfair treatment by Pacific Airways. The stories poured in. A respected professor was moved to economy despite his business class ticket. A successful restaurateur was repeatedly ignored in the first-class lounge while other passengers received attentive service. An elderly couple was spoken to rudely when they couldn't understand English well. Each account was carefully verified and added to a growing database. One rainy evening, as she reviewed the latest findings, a young researcher burst into her office. "You need to see this," he said, placing a stack of financial reports on her desk. The documents revealed something interesting. Pacific Airways was struggling. Behind their prestigious image and premium prices lay a company drowning in debt and losing market share. Their investigation uncovered more than just discrimination. The airline's problems ran deep, outdated systems, poor employee training, and a management structure that hadn't changed since the 1980s. Customer satisfaction scores were dropping across all routes, but especially on Asian ones. She spent hours studying the airline industry, learning its intricacies. Her tech background proved surprisingly useful. Both industries were about connecting people and managing complex systems. Late at night, surrounded by reports and data, she could see the solution taking shape. The most revealing information came from current and former Pacific Airways employees. A flight attendant, speaking anonymously, shared stories of an internal culture that encouraged subtle discrimination. "We were never directly told to treat anyone differently," she explained, "but the implied messages were clear from our training and supervision." A former manager provided internal memos showing how the airline allocated resources differently based on route demographics. Premium services were concentrated on routes popular with Western travelers, while Asian routes received less attention despite generating significant revenue. The businesswoman organized this mountain of evidence meticulously. Each piece fit into a larger puzzle, revealing a company that had failed to adapt to the modern world. Pacific Airways was still operating like it was the 1960s, when air travel was an exclusive luxury for a select few. She brought in legal experts to review her findings. "You have enough here for a massive discrimination lawsuit," one lawyer advised. But that wasn't her goal. She didn't want to destroy Pacific Airways. She wanted to transform it. During this time, she continued flying with the airline, observing everything with new eyes. She noticed how the ground staff's attitudes varied depending on the passenger's appearance, how seating arrangements followed subtle but consistent patterns, how the whole system was built on outdated assumptions about who belonged in premium cabins. One day, while watching passengers board a Pacific Airways flight, she overheard a young girl ask her mother why they couldn't sit in the nice seats at the front. The mother quickly hushed her child, but the moment struck a chord. This wasn't just about business class seats or service quality. It was about dignity and respect. That evening, she made a decision. The investigation phase was complete. She had all the evidence she needed. Now it was time for action. As she closed the final report, she picked up her phone to call her investment team. The real work was about to begin. The sleek conference room on the 32nd floor of her tech company's headquarters had become a war room. Maps covered one wall, showing Pacific Airways routes across Asia and beyond. Another wall displayed charts tracking the airline's stock price, which had been steadily declining over the past 5 years. "The numbers tell a clear story," explained her chief financial advisor, pointing to the latest analysis. "Pacific Airways is vulnerable. Their reputation is strong, but their finances are weak." Around the long table sat a carefully chosen team: lawyers, aviation experts, and financial analysts, all working together to build their case. The businesswoman had learned early in her career that the best battles were won with preparation. She'd spent weeks studying successful corporate takeovers, understanding not just the financial aspects, but the human elements too. This wasn't just about buying shares, it was about winning hearts and minds. Her team had created detailed profiles of every board member and major shareholder. They discovered that many were frustrated with the airline's declining performance but felt powerless to change things. The current management had been in place for decades, resistant to any suggestion of modernization. One afternoon, while reviewing employee satisfaction surveys, she noticed something interesting. The lowest scores came from frontline staff, the very people who dealt with passengers daily. Further investigation revealed that many employees felt trapped between outdated policies and their own sense of right and wrong. "I had to follow the rules," admitted a former check-in supervisor during a confidential interview. "But every time I had to treat someone unfairly, it felt wrong." Many of us wanted changes, but nobody would listen. These testimonies became crucial parts of her strategy. The legal team worked overtime, ensuring every move would be legitimate and well documented. They weren't just building a case for ownership. They were creating a blueprint for transformation. Each document was carefully prepared, every strategy thoroughly vetted. Late one evening, as she reviewed the latest draft of their proposal, a maintenance worker came in to clean the conference room. She noticed how he carefully arranged each chair, making sure everything was perfect for the next day's meetings. It reminded her that every business was ultimately about people, from the highest executive to the newest employee. The financial strategy took shape like a complex puzzle. They would start by purchasing small blocks of shares through various investment vehicles, staying under the radar. The goal was to avoid driving up the stock price before they had secured a significant position. Her team discovered that several institutional investors were dissatisfied with their Pacific Airways holdings but hadn't found a good opportunity to sell. This presented a perfect opportunity for quiet negotiations. One by one, they approached these investors with fair offers. The hardest part was keeping everything confidential. The businesswoman continued flying Pacific Airways regularly, observing and taking notes, all while quietly becoming one of its largest shareholders. She experienced firsthand the issues she planned to fix: delayed flights, inconsistent service, and that ever-present undercurrent of discrimination. During one flight, she watched a flight attendant handle a difficult situation with remarkable grace, despite having little support from the airline's rigid policies. These were the kind of employees she wanted to retain and empower once she took control. The plan wasn't just about acquiring shares, it was about being ready for what came after. Her team developed detailed proposals for modernizing everything from booking systems to staff training. They researched successful airlines around the world, learning from both their achievements and mistakes. As their stake in the airline grew, so did their understanding of its problems and potential. Pacific Airways wasn't just an airline with discrimination problems. It was an airline that had stopped evolving. But beneath its outdated practices and failing policies, she saw the possibility for something remarkable. One evening, reviewing the growing stack of documents that represented months of work, she found her original notes from that first discriminatory incident. Reading them now, she realized how far they'd come from that initial moment of humiliation. Soon, very soon, those notes would become more than just a record of injustice. They would become the catalyst for change. The stock market's closing bell echoed through the financial district as the businesswoman sat in her office, watching the final trades of the day. Her team had just completed their largest purchase of Pacific Airways shares yet. The move had been perfectly timed. Right after a disappointing quarterly earnings report had pushed the stock price even lower. "We now own 23% of the airline," her financial director announced, his voice betraying a mix of excitement and nervousness. They were no longer just major shareholders. They were on the verge of becoming the largest single owner of Pacific Airways. The journey to this point had been like walking a tightrope. Each share purchase had to be carefully orchestrated to avoid attracting attention. They used different investment firms, spread transactions across various accounts, and maintained absolute secrecy. The current board remained unaware of how their company's ownership was quietly shifting. During this time, she continued flying Pacific Airways, now with a different perspective. Each flight felt like visiting a house she was secretly buying. She noticed every crack in the service, every opportunity for improvement, but also every moment of genuine care from staff members who did their best despite the system's limitations. On one flight, she watched a young flight attendant quietly upgrade an elderly passenger who was struggling with the limited legroom and economy. It wasn't company policy. It was simple human kindness. These were the kinds of actions her new airline would encourage, not punish. The next phase of her plan began to unfold. Her team started reaching out to other shareholders, building alliances. They found many who shared their vision for change but had never had the power to make it happen. Each conversation was carefully documented, each potential ally noted. One morning, she received an unexpected call. A retired Pacific Airways pilot had heard rumors about her share purchases. Instead of being suspicious, he offered his support. "This airline used to be about bringing people together," he said, his voice heavy with years of experience. "Somewhere along the way, we forgot that." The timing was crucial. The airline's annual shareholder meeting was approaching. Behind the scenes, her team prepared mountains of documentation, financial reports, customer satisfaction data, employee surveys, and detailed plans for modernization. Every number told a story of an airline in need of change. She spent evenings rehearsing her presentation, knowing she would have just one chance to win over the other shareholders. Her tech background had taught her that the best innovations come from understanding both systems and people. This would be her biggest test of that principle. The night before the shareholder meeting, she visited her father. Over a simple dinner, like the ones from her childhood, she shared her plans. He listened quietly, then smiled. "You're not just buying an airline," he said. "You're buying a chance to make things right." That same evening, one of her investigators brought in a final piece of evidence: internal memos showing how the airline's current management had actively resisted modernization and diversity initiatives. These documents would prove crucial in the coming confrontation. As she prepared for bed that night, she received messages from her team members. Everyone was ready. Lawyers had double-checked every document. Financial advisors had confirmed their numbers. Communications experts had prepared for every possible scenario. Looking out her window at the city lights, she thought about how far she'd come from that humiliating morning at the check-in counter. Tomorrow, she would walk into the Pacific Airways shareholders meeting not as a passenger who had been discriminated against, but as someone with the power to ensure it never happened to anyone else. She laid out her outfit for the next day, the same business suit she'd worn when they'd questioned her first-class ticket. It would be a reminder of why she was doing this. This wasn't just about business anymore. It was about proving that change was possible when someone had the courage to demand it. Just before falling asleep, she checked the latest stock prices one last time. Tomorrow would be more than a shareholders meeting. It would be the beginning of a new chapter in aviation history, one where dignity and respect weren't determined by how someone looked or where they came from. The Pacific Airways shareholders meeting was held in a grand hotel ballroom, all crystal chandeliers and polished marble. The businesswoman arrived early, watching as board members and shareholders filed in, many giving her curious glances. Few recognized her as one of the airline's largest shareholders. They just saw what they'd always seen: a young Asian woman who didn't fit their image of corporate power. The meeting began with the usual formalities. The chairman, a man who'd held his position for 15 years, started his rehearsed speech about the airline's proud tradition and commitment to excellence. His words rang hollow in the face of declining profits and mounting customer complaints. When the time came for shareholder comments, she stood up. The room fell silent as she walked to the podium, her heels clicking against the marble floor. The chairman's smile wavered slightly. Something about her confident stride told him this wouldn't be a routine question. "Good morning," she began, her voice clear and steady. "I represent 23 Capital." She paused as whispers spread through the room. Everyone knew that name now. the mysterious investment group that had been buying up shares. And I have some questions about how this airline is being run. She started with the numbers, the declining passenger satisfaction rates, the dropping stock price, the increasing complaints. Her presentation was precise, backed by months of research. But then she did something unexpected. She shared stories. She told them about the elderly couple separated on their 50th anniversary flight because of computer errors, about the young professional who missed a crucial business meeting because ground staff wouldn't believe his business class ticket was legitimate, about the flight attendants who wanted to provide better service but were bound by discriminatory policies. The chairman tried to interrupt, but she pressed on. And yes, she said, looking directly at him, I was one of those passengers. Standing at your first-class counter, holding a valid ticket, being told I didn't belong there. The room grew so quiet you could hear the air conditioning hum. She clicked to the next slide, revealing internal documents that showed systematic bias in service delivery. The board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. These weren't just statistics. They were evidence of a broken system. But I'm not here to complain, she continued. I'm here to fix this. She laid out her vision for the airline. Modern booking systems, comprehensive staff training, transparent service policies. We can make Pacific Airways the industry leader it pretends to be. The chairman finally found his voice. These changes would be too costly, he protested. Our traditional customers. Your traditional customers are leaving, she interrupted, displaying another graph. While airlines that embrace diversity and modern service standards are growing. The world has changed. Pacific Airways must change with it. She revealed her full ownership stake. The gasps were audible. She now controlled enough shares to force a board vote. But that wasn't her goal. I don't want to take over hostile, she explained. I want to work together. But make no mistake, change will come. An elderly board member stood up. Everyone expected him to defend the old guard. Instead, he smiled. I've been saying for years we needed new blood, he said. Maybe it's time we listened. The momentum shifted. Other shareholders began speaking up, sharing their own frustrations with the airline's decline. The chairman's face grew redder with each comment. His power was slipping away in real time. By meeting's end, she had secured enough votes for major changes. The chairman offered his resignation, trying to save face. As people filed out of the ballroom, many stopped to shake her hand or share their own stories. A young flight attendant approached her last. I saw you on one of my flights, she said quietly. I wanted to apologize for how you were treated. The businesswoman smiled. Don't apologize, she replied. Help me make sure it never happens again. Standing alone in the empty ballroom, she took a deep breath. The hard part was just beginning. Buying an airline had been a bold move. Transforming it would be even harder. But looking at her reflection in the marble floor, she knew one thing for certain. No passenger would ever again be made to feel they didn't belong. The morning after the shareholders' meeting, reality set in. The businesswoman sat in what was now her office at Pacific Airways headquarters, surrounded by stacks of reports and employee files. The view of the runway through her window served as a constant reminder of the enormous task ahead. Some senior managers have already resigned, her HR director reported during their first morning meeting. They're calling it a protest against radical change. She wasn't surprised. Change always met resistance, especially from those who benefited from the old system. The first week was chaos. Email servers crashed under the flood of messages from employees and customers. Everyone had an opinion on what needed to change first. Some longtime customers threatened to leave, posting angry comments on social media about maintaining standards. But for every angry comment, there were 3 messages of support. She started where she knew best, at the front lines. Instead of staying in her office, she spent days at different airports, talking to ground staff, baggage handlers, and flight attendants. She sat in economy class, chatting with passengers about their experiences. Every conversation added another piece to the puzzle. One day, she overheard a senior flight attendant telling a new hire, "Forget what they taught you in the old training. Just treat everyone like they're your favorite aunt or uncle." That became the seed of their new service philosophy: simple, human, and universal. The technology overhaul came next. Her background in tech proved invaluable as they modernized everything from the booking system to crew scheduling. But it wasn't just about new computers, it was about changing how people worked together. Some changes were simple but symbolic. The old first-class lounge dress code, which had been used to exclude certain passengers, was replaced with a simple rule: all premium ticket holders welcome. The complicated seating policies that somehow always separated certain types of passengers were scrapped. But the biggest challenge was changing people's mindsets. During a particularly tense training session, an older crew member stood up. "I've been flying for 30 years, he announced. "Why should I change now?" The room fell silent, waiting for her response. She shared a story about her grandfather, who had worked in a television repair shop. When color TVs arrived, he had to learn entirely new skills. "He could have retired," she said. Instead, he became the best color TV repairman in town. Not because he had to, but because he saw change as an opportunity to grow. The message spread. Gradually, resistance turned to curiosity, and curiosity to enthusiasm. Employees began sharing ideas for improvements. A baggage handler suggested a new tracking system. A check-in agent designed a better way to handle family seating. Every suggestion was heard, every idea considered. There were setbacks, of course. A rushed software update caused chaos at several airports. Some longtime employees struggled to adapt and left. Media critics questioned whether an airline could survive while prioritizing social justice over profit. But she stuck to her plan. Every decision was guided by a simple question: would I want my family treated this way? When in doubt, they chose kindness over rules, humanity over efficiency. To everyone's surprise, efficiency improved anyway. Happy employees did better work. One rainy afternoon, she was walking through Terminal 3 when she noticed something interesting. A ground staff member was helping an elderly passenger with his bags, not because of any policy, but because it was the right thing to do. Nearby, a mix of passengers chatted comfortably in the premium lounge, no one questioning anyone's right to be there. "You started something remarkable," her father said during one of their weekly dinners. "But it's not just about the airline anymore, is it?" He was right. They weren't just changing an airline. They were showing that success and fairness could go hand in hand. As she drove home that evening, she passed a billboard for Pacific Airways. The new slogan read simply, "Everyone's welcome up here." Looking at it, she remembered that morning at the check-in counter, how small and angry she had felt. Now that feeling was becoming a distant memory, replaced by something much more powerful: hope. 6 months into the transformation, Pacific Airways faced its biggest test. A major competitor launched an aggressive price war, specifically targeting their most profitable routes. Industry experts predicted disaster. "They're too focused on feel-good policies," one analyst wrote. They'd forgotten this as a business. The businesswoman called an emergency meeting in the airline's operations center. Screens showed flight paths and booking data, while worried faces waited for her response to the crisis. The old Pacific Airways would have cut services and raised prices. But she had a different idea. "Let's show them what real service looks like," she announced. Instead of cutting back, they doubled down on their new approach. When competitors dropped prices, Pacific Airways added value: better meals, more legroom, friendlier service. They turned their planes into flying examples of their philosophy. The results surprised everyone except those who worked there. Passengers began choosing Pacific Airways even when tickets cost a bit more. "It's worth it," one frequent flyer told a reporter. "You feel like a human being here, not just a seat number." Their reputation spread through social media. A video went viral showing a Pacific Airways crew helping a grandmother learn to use her seat's entertainment system. Another showed ground staff throwing an impromptu birthday celebration for a delayed child passenger. These weren't publicity stunts. They were everyday moments captured by amazed passengers. But success brought new challenges. Other airlines started copying their policies. Competitors hired away their trained staff. The businesswoman watched as her innovations became industry standards. Good, she told her worried board members. That means we have to innovate again. They launched programs that competitors couldn't easily copy. Every employee spent time working different jobs. Pilots helped load baggage, executives worked as flight attendants, ground staff flew as passengers. "You can't truly fix problems you haven't experienced," became their motto. One day, she received a letter from a young girl who had flown with them. "My mom says you own the airline," the letter read. "I'd want to be like you when I grow up. Not because you're rich, but because you made things fair." That letter joined her father's newspaper clippings on her office wall. The transformation wasn't just about passenger service. They revolutionized their hiring practices, focusing on attitude over experience. Their training program became famous for teaching empathy alongside safety procedures. Other airlines sent observers trying to understand how Pacific Airways had achieved such high employee satisfaction scores. There were still difficult moments. A senior manager was caught reverting to old discriminatory practices. His dismissal made headlines, but she stood firm. "Our values aren't just words on a wall," she told the press. "They're how we do business." During a particularly turbulent period of high fuel prices, she called her father for advice. "Remember when your first software company almost failed?" he asked. "What saved you then?" The answer was simple. She had trusted her employees to find solutions. She did the same now. The staff responded with incredible creativity. Pilots suggested fuel-saving flight patterns. Flight attendants found ways to reduce waste. Ground crews developed more efficient boarding procedures. Every small improvement added up to significant savings. One evening, she was flying economy class, something she did regularly to experience her own airline service. An elderly passenger recognized her. "You're the owner, aren't you?" he asked. "My wife and I flew with Pacific Airways 40 years ago on our honeymoon. Now we're flying to see our grandchildren. The airline has changed so much, but somehow it feels more like home than ever." Looking around the cabin, she saw what he meant. The crew moved with confident kindness. Passengers from all backgrounds sat comfortably together. There was an atmosphere of respect that no policy manual could create. It came from people who believed in what they were doing. As the plane cruised through the night sky, she opened her laptop to review the latest performance figures. The numbers were good, but they weren't what made her proud. It was the stories, the daily moments of human connection that were becoming Pacific Airways' true trademark. 5 years had passed since that life-changing morning at the check-in counter. The businesswoman stood at the podium of the Asian Aviation Awards, where Pacific Airways had just been named Airline of the Year for the second time running. But it wasn't the crystal trophy that made her proud. It was the reason they had won. Pacific Airways hasn't just transformed itself, the judge's statement read. It has transformed how we think about air travel. The audience included many familiar faces, competitors who had once mocked their soft approach to business, now taking notes on their success. After the ceremony, she walked through Terminal 1, where it had all begun. The first-class counter looked the same, but everything else had changed. The staff moved with quiet confidence, treating every passenger with the same warm respect. No one was made to feel they didn't belong. A young employee approached her, clutching a tablet. "I wanted to show you something," she said excitedly. It was their latest customer satisfaction scores, the highest in the industry. But what caught the businesswoman's eye was a small note at the bottom. 0 discrimination complaints for the 3rd straight year. In the staff room, she found a group of employees having lunch together, pilots, ground crew, flight attendants, all sharing stories and laughing. The old hierarchies had melted away, replaced by a genuine sense of teamwork. One of them was teaching others phrases in his native language, adding to their ability to make more passengers feel welcome. Later that afternoon, she visited the airline's training center. New recruits were going through their orientation, but it was unlike any airline training she'd seen before. Along with safety procedures and service protocols, they learned about different cultures, studied body language, and practiced empathy through role-playing exercises. Remember, the instructor was saying, every passenger has a story. Your job isn't just to get them from point A to point B. It's to make their journey part of that story. The businesswoman smiled, remembering how her own story had become intertwined with the airlines. In her office, she kept a special wall she called the memory lane. It displayed photos and letters from passengers and employees over the years. There was the wedding photo from a couple who met on one of their flights, the thank you note from a child who'd lost his favorite toy and had it personally delivered by a crew member, the retirement letter from a veteran employee who wrote, "You made me proud to wear this uniform again." That evening, she had dinner with her father at their usual spot. "Did you ever imagine," he asked, "that being treated badly would lead to all this?" She thought about it while stirring her tea. The answer was both no and yes. No one could have predicted this exact outcome, but she had always believed that doing the right thing would lead somewhere good. The next morning, she arrived early at the airport for a flight to Hong Kong. As she approached the first-class counter, a new employee she didn't recognize greeted her warmly. There was no hesitation, no questioning looks, just professional courtesy. She showed her ticket and received her boarding pass with a genuine smile. Walking to the gate, she passed a wall of photographs showing the airline's history. There she was, 5 years younger, announcing the changes that would transform Pacific Airways. But the most important changes weren't captured in those photos. They were in the small, daily interactions that made every passenger feel valued. On board, she settled into her seat, watching other passengers board. A young girl in economy was excitedly telling her mother she wanted to be a pilot. An elderly man was being gently helped with his bag. A group of business travelers from different countries chatted like old friends in the lounge area. As the plane took off into the sunset, she opened her laptop to work on their next initiative, a scholarship program for aspiring aviation professionals from underprivileged backgrounds. The airline had become more than just a business. It was a platform for change, a daily demonstration that success and humanity could go hand in hand. Looking out at the clouds painted golden by the setting sun, she thought about that morning 5 years ago when she'd been made to feel small. Now she knew the truth. No one is small unless we allow them to be. In the end, the greatest luxury wasn't the first-class seat or the premium service. It was the simple dignity of being treated like a human being.